Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, as a career prosecutor, I dealt with lots of folks who experienced trauma, often significant trauma, whether they were victims of crime or witnesses to, for example, violent crime. And there are some unsung heroes of the criminal justice system, including at the Department of Justice, and they are the victim support experts, the victims' rights advocates who helped people through those traumatic experiences. And friends, when I think about things like victim support, victim services, victims' rights, there's one person who comes to mind for me who falls into that category of unsung heroes, and her name is Kate Manning. For 15 years, Kate was with the Department of Justice as a victim support expert, a victims' rights advocate, and Kate provided services and support to victims in so many cases, including the Pulse Nightclub mass shooting case and the Boston Marathon bombing case. And even after leaving the Department of Justice, Kate continues to work in the victims' rights arena, and she continues to work with folks who have experienced or are currently in trauma, including helping both employees and employers deal with trauma in the workplace. So I had a recent opportunity to sit down with my friend Kate Manning and talk about her body of work with the Department of Justice, what she's doing now to help victims, and I discussed with her her remarkable book called The Empathetic Workplace. Friends, I hope you enjoy this extended conversation with my friend, Kate Manning. Okay, friends, welcome to another edition of Justice Matters One-on-One. I am really excited today because I get to sit down with an old friend, with a former Department of Justice colleague, somebody who, when career prosecutors in Washington, D.C. think about victim advocacy, think about victim services, think about the training that we received from the Department of Justice, from the folks who were experts on how to deal with victims in criminal cases. This is the person I think of. This is Kathrine Kate Manning, who worked at the Department of Justice for 15 years and has continued in her mission to support and serve victims. And we're going to be talking about all of that. But first, let me welcome to Justice Matters my friend Kate Manning.
It's so good to see you.
So good to see you again. I think we both ended up leaving the Department of Justice at about the same time. I left in 2018. You left in 2019. But fortunately, we've tried to keep up over the years, and I've been seeing all the remarkable work in the victims' rights and advocacy arena that you continue to do even after leaving the Department of Justice. So let me just tell the viewers a little bit about your experience as in the victims' rights arena. From 2004 to 2019, Kate was at the Department of Justice in victims' rights and services. I'm not going to do a deep dive on this yet, but I promise I will. There's something called the Crime Victims' Rights Act, the CVRA, which was passed by Congress and signed into law in 2004. And it was a sea change in the way prosecutors and government employees and officials at the Department of Justice approached and dealt with victims and victims' rights. And we had a point person from the Department of Justice who would go around nationwide to all of the U.S. attorneys' offices and teach we prosecutors what the Crime Victims' Rights Act was all about, what we were now required to do to make sure we were honoring these newly created victims' rights. And that person was Kate Manning. She probably trained more federal prosecutors on the CVRA than she could ever remember. So she was just an extraordinary asset to all of us out in the field as a victims' rights and services expert. And while at the Department of Justice, some of what Kate did was, for example, She helped the Department of Justice navigate victim issues in cases like the Pulse Nightclub shooting, in cases like the Boston Marathon bombing. So, she really was the point person on helping victims navigate these impossibly difficult circumstances after they have experienced those kinds of traumas. In her post-DOJ career, she's the author of a remarkable book that I'm going to ask her about today. It's titled The Empathetic Workplace: 5 Steps to a Compassionate, Calm, and Confident Response to Trauma on the Job. And I don't think I have to tell anybody that we probably have more than our share of trauma in the workplace these days, including our former home, the Department of Justice, the federal government. She also recently was named the president of the board of directors of a remarkable organization in Washington, D.C., one that I'm well familiar with. It is the Wendt Center for Loss and Healing. I'm going to have her talk a little bit about her work with the Wendt Center. And then we're going to finish up by having her talk about her current endeavor. It's something called Blackbird, and she is the president of Blackbird. It involves training and consulting on building trauma-informed workplaces. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what trauma-informed communication and services are all about. And I can say, as an officer of the court, I have to tell the truth, the reason I know things about trauma-informed communication in the work I did as a prosecutor was in large part because I learned from Kate Manning. So, Kate, with all of that was a very long introduction, but you have accomplished so much. But let me start by asking you to tell the viewers a little bit about your 15 years with the Department of Justice and the work you did in the victims' rights and victim services arena.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn. It is such a pleasure to be back here talking with you. I always love chatting with you because you are a prosecutor who always had in your heart the victims. It was always what drove you in the courtroom, and you always had at the forefront of your mind the families, and it was always clear that that was at the very heart of the work that you did. And so for me, as somebody who was working on behalf of victims' rights and services at the department, it was always such an honor to be able to work with a prosecutor like you. So it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Very kind. Thank you.
So the question of my work at DOJ, first of all, I came to this work not as a prosecutor, but as somebody who came from a victim background. I came from a family history of domestic violence. And when I got to college, I started doing hotline work, domestic violence, rape crisis kind of work. It was that work that pushed me to go to law school. And my first few years I spent at a big law firm out in San Francisco, but pretty quickly realized that I would be happier doing more mission-driven work, and was fortunate to get this job at DOJ. And I started 2 weeks before the Crime Victims' Rights Act passed. And as you said, it was really a sea change, not so much in the rights themselves. The rights didn't change from a previous victims' rights law. They had been on the books for a while. But what changed was the enforcement mechanisms. For the first time on the federal level, victims had the right to stand up in court and say to the judge, I disagree. I don't think you should accept this plea. I want you to hear from me. I have a difference of opinion with the prosecutor. I think the sentence should be something different. And they had the ability to go to what was later called the Victims' Rights Ombudsman within the Justice Department and say, I think this prosecutor or this law enforcement agent or victim advocate violated my rights. I didn't get notice of this change of plea hearing, or this person didn't treat me with the respect that I have a right to. And the department was able to actually discipline employees, including firing people for violating victims' rights. That's what really led to this sea change, because prosecutors, they always knew victims had these rights, but suddenly they were sitting up and saying, wait a second, I can be fired? Or, if I don't give a victim their rights, they can actually stand up and argue against what I'm saying to the judge. That was a complete difference. So that it was what led to a whole lot of training and policy, updates that had to happen around the department pretty quickly back in 2004 and really throughout my time at DOJ. So I was there from about 2004 to 2019 and worked on just a wide array of cases. You mentioned a few of them, but it was everything from giant fraud cases to terrorism, child exploitation, crimes in Indian country. Some of the things that became clear to me and really led to my work after DOJ were things like, it wasn't like people needed different things based on what crime they were a victim of. It wasn't like the way that we would support a victim of terrorism was all that different than the way we would support a victim of human trafficking. Everybody needed acknowledgement that something horrible had happened to them. Everybody needed some resources, some supports to get on their feet again. And then the other thing I started to realize was that it wasn't just our victims who needed those things. It was the prosecutors, it was the agents, it was me. All of us kind of need those supports when we go through hard things, whether it's something related to the case you're prosecuting, whether it's just life related. I realized that the ways that I was making sure we were showing up for the victims in our cases were very similar to the ways that I was supporting a colleague, for instance, who was going through a divorce or who had a parent who was dying. And I just started to see these parallels, that trauma is trauma is trauma. And it doesn't matter what causes it. We all need the same things when we're going through trauma.
And it sounds like the experiences that you had, dealing with victims' rights and victim services in the context of criminal cases at the Department of Justice really kind of translated into your post-DOJ career. And it's interesting, you said a minute ago that, the prosecutors, we like to think that we're big and strong and tough and we can handle all of this. But the trauma that we were exposed to, certainly through dealing with our victims, begins to creep in. And it has an impact on the prosecutors and the paralegals and, the support staff. And so it sounds like, not wanting to speak for you, some of what you learned at the Department of Justice may have inspired you to kind of carry over into the private sector, your work with victims services, and even beyond that, sort of trauma in the workplace generally. And talk a little bit about your book, The Empathetic Workplace, and sort of what you've been able to accomplish, because you were telling me a little bit about what you have done talking with universities, for example, or businesses that have experienced significant trauma in their respective workplaces. And you've been able to bring what you learned at the Department of Justice into that setting as well. So talk a little bit about your book and some of the work you've done since leaving DOJ.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, first off, let me say that so much of what I am doing now and applying now came from victim advocates. I mean, those victim advocates are amazing. They are so wise and smart and compassionate. And I learned from them every day that I was at DOJ. They would remind me again and again and again to be present, to look at the heart of the matter. I remember once I was in a conversation with a woman who was the head of the fraud unit for a big U.S. attorney's office and a victim advocate for that same U.S. attorney's office. And the woman who was the head of the fraud unit was talking about when she herself was a victim of fraud and saying, it's really hard. And she said, these cases, like the fraud schemes can be really difficult. And I myself was so stupid. I fell for one of these schemes myself. And I kind of said, yeah, it can happen. And the advocate said, hang on, you are not stupid. Like this person knows how to target people. They are very, very good at this. And this does not mean you are stupid. And I thought, right, you're not stupid. And I thought, this is what you need to do, is interrupt when people start to do that to themselves, to denigrate themselves. And it just reminded me again, those advocates, they are so wise. And so it was those kinds of interactions that I had again and again with the advocates that really taught me how to be more empathetic, how to be more trauma informed. And that's what I do now again and again, is try to apply that.
And let me just say, because you've touched a nerve in a good way. So when you talk about victim advocates, let me just tell our viewers, every U.S. attorney's office, and I would assume most local state prosecutors' offices, have victim advocates, so it's sort of social workers, but not necessarily social workers. And they will provide services to victims and witnesses across the spectrum of an enormous number of cases. Let me give you an example. As homicide prosecutors, we might be carrying 20 or 25 cases in our caseload. We had a woman named Marcy Rinker. I say her name the way I would say Mother Teresa. She had about 250 cases in which she was providing support and services for not just the victims in those cases, but when you're involved in handling violent crime cases, the witnesses are often victims because of what they have experienced as a result of witnessing violent crime. So I thought I was carrying a heavy caseload with 25 murder cases. Marcy Rinker would be carrying 250 cases and would be devoting time and attention to every one of those victims and witnesses. And they were indispensable. We couldn't do what we did in the violent crime practice without the Marcy Rinkers of the world. So I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh,
Go ahead.
No, absolutely. I love it. And she is incredible. Absolutely. And so you're right. I mean, taking those lessons from the criminal justice system, and also, to be clear, you're absolutely right that the toll that those cases take on the prosecutors, on the advocates, on the agents, it takes a toll on them who are doing those cases. But also it was, me starting to realize in around 2018, it was honestly Me Too. When the Me Too movement happened, I started to realize that these issues were not just happening in the criminal justice system. They were happening in other workplaces around the world. And that's when I started thinking about writing a book, because when Me Too happened, I was on the one hand really glad that people were having these conversations, because these were issues that I'd been thinking about for so long. But I also, frankly, kind of frustrated by Me Too, because I felt like it was putting so much on survivors. Share your story. Everybody needs to hear your story, without an understanding that when somebody shares their story of trauma, you have an obligation as the listener to listen in a certain way and to provide support. And I knew, because of all the work I'd been doing at DOJ, that you could do that while still conducting a full and fair investigation. And in fact, those things were not at odds. They were actually essential to be doing together. You would get better information when the person was getting support and they knew that the investigation was being done in a fair way. So I started thinking about, people say when something makes you mad, that becomes your job, right? So what is it you think should happen when somebody makes a disclosure of trauma in the workplace? And ultimately, I decided there were 5 things that should happen in that conversation. Listen. And what I mean by that is active listening, which is more than just sitting there quietly. It's creating the circumstances where they feel comfortable opening up. So giving them your full attention, asking questions, letting them know that it's okay to go on. So listen, acknowledging, letting them know you heard them. So thank you for sharing. So we were talking earlier about it, and an acknowledgement we want to avoid is, I know how you feel, right?
Everything's going to be okay.
It's all going to be fine.
That's not trauma-informed listening or communication.
Yeah, exactly. Acknowledgement that is better than that is something like, thank you for letting me know, or, that sounds like you've been through a lot. So listen, acknowledge, share information back with them. I'm sure that's something you saw a lot as a prosecutor, is how much people crave information. What I later have come to understand is that when our world feels turned upside down, one of the things that can help us regain a sense of control in a time that feels very out of control is knowledge, right? Knowledge is power. So we want information. So we share with them facts or process information, values information, like, this is not something that should have happened to you. So listen, acknowledge, share information, empower with resources. So like, this is where you go to get mental health counseling, and then return, check in on them later. And also importantly, checking in on yourself. Self-care has to be a part of this as well. Yes.
So let me do this. I want to ask you a little bit more about the book, and then how you have taken that and created Blackbird, and you're now out in the field, sort of not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, helping people and organizations that have been through sometimes horrific, traumatic experiences. Let me just take the interviewer's privilege and read a little bit of a summary about your book, The Empathetic Workplace. This critical resource gives managers, HR, and anyone who may come into contact with someone in trauma, including workplace trauma, harassment, assault, illness, addiction, fraud, bankruptcy, and more, gives those people the tools they need to prepare for what lies ahead. This book is crucial for every manager or HR representative who shouldn't just prepare to one day be faced with a report of traumatic experience at work, but plan on it. And so talk a little bit about, the book, and then how you have translated that into your work with Blackbird.
The reality is, if you work with people, you are already working with people in trauma. The research shows that 70% of adults have experienced at least one trauma. And if you get to the point of elders, it's about 90%. So all of us are going to experience trauma at some point. And for most of us, that means we're already working with people in trauma. And certainly right now, when we look at the statistics, just because of, since the 2020s have started, it's like trauma is kind of the air we've been breathing, with COVID and George Floyd and Israel and Palestine and political upheaval and environmental disasters and all of the, mass violence, and just on and on and on. I mean, it has just been everywhere around us. If we are willing to talk about it and give people the space to be honest and authentic about what they are experiencing, some pretty incredible things happen, right? So one, if we have a workplace that is trauma-informed, right, where people are able to talk about what it is they are actually experiencing, one, healing goes up, right? People are better able to get through what it is that they're experiencing. Their healthier well-being goes up. Two, trust between colleagues skyrockets, because the people who really show up for you in your hard times, those are the people who are there for you forever. And then three, our mission success goes up. We're better able to do our jobs. And so you see psychological safety in the workplace go up. Trust across the organization goes up. You just see higher workplace success across the board. So ensuring that everybody has the skills to talk about challenging issues with more skill is just going to create a better workplace environment across the board. And that's really what I'm aiming for. The point here is not to become your colleague's therapist. Even if you are a therapist, you shouldn't be doing that for your colleague. I think of this as kind of it's like your, like the EMT skills almost for mental health. It's like you're there on the scene, you see the person who is struggling, you provide immediate support, and then you refer them on to experts to the extent that they need it. That's really what we're aiming for.
So people can obviously read the book, learn from the book, but then you are actually out there in the world kind of applying these principles and providing your services. And is there any one, I don't know if you would call them a client, or one organization that you have provided services for that you could maybe share a story about with us?
Sure. I mean, I've done training and consulting that's all around this topic of building trauma-informed workplaces. And sometimes it's what I think of as proactive, which is an organization just says, we want to make sure that we have the skills to navigate these issues. And that might be because they work in an industry where they are dealing a lot with those in trauma, which might be healthcare, for instance, or, I mean, frankly, higher ed has a lot of folks dealing with trauma right now. Or it might be an organization where something has happened. There's been an episode of workplace violence, for instance, and I come in. Virginia Beach is one of my clients that I've worked with. They had an episode of workplace violence. Gunman came in. I've worked with University of Arizona in the aftermath.
Can you tell me a little bit? You were telling me about that case where you came in after they had a really traumatic incident there.
Yeah, it was just an awful case where a former student killed a member of the faculty on campus. And it was just devastating across the community. And in the aftermath of that, I did training for faculty members, for leadership, webinars, kind of more proximately, immediately. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the webinars was that it was an opportunity for faculty members to communicate with each other. It was such a horrific incident, really traumatic. And I was so glad to see the faculty members supporting each other. I mean, happy is maybe not the right word for it, but it was just really, really wonderful to see the ways that they were showing up for each other in the aftermath of that just awful experience, sharing about, well, this is what happened in our classroom as we were on lockdown, or this is, the student asked me this thing and I wasn't sure what to say. And how did you handle if you got a similar question? And it was just so nice to see the ways that they were supporting one another. And I always love that in a training. I mean, to me, I feel like a training is always a conversation. And I always want trauma-informed practice is never about me being the sage on the stage, right? It's always about making sure that everybody feels empowered to use their own voice. Everybody here has knowledge about all of these topics. And I want to make sure that everybody has that voice. And it's about creating the environment where people know how to support each other, because I'm going to leave. I'm going to come in and do the training. I did this training at Arizona, right? So I did the webinars. I came on campus and did a lot of work with them, but then I left. And I want all of them to have developed the skills so that they can continue supporting each other, continue having these conversations that are authentic to them, to the institution, the values of that place, that will carry them for the months and years and decades to come. It's not about how do we get through this one incident. It's about building a trauma-informed culture at this place that will carry us for decades to come. That's really the goal.
And so talk a little bit now about Blackbird, because that is your organization by which you provide these services. And how can people find you if they're interested in learning more, or maybe, using your services?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is kathrinemanning.com, or you can find it as well through blackbird-dc.com. I do in-person and I do webinars. I'm on LinkedIn and on Facebook and Instagram. I'm going to try to get on Substack.
I've been pushing you to get on Substack. Yeah.
I'm going to try that. And I do a weekly text. That's one of the things I really enjoy, Glenn. Every Thursday at about noon Eastern time. That's one of the ways that I enjoy engaging with my community is I send out a text message every Thursday at about noon Eastern time. And it's just about empathy and leadership and resilience. I send out tips about self-care or about building that kind of workplace where people feel supported. And it's just been a really nice way for me to stay in touch with people and keep these ideas front of mind. So if people are interested in that, that's another way to stay in touch. You just text the word Blackbird to 833-975-1945. And it's free and you can opt out anytime. So if people are interested, that's another way to stay in touch.
And so our viewers know all of this will be put in the description for this video, that number, all of the links where you can find Kate and her work and her organization. And you just used the E word, empathy. And, to me, it feels like empathy is one of our superpowers. Without it, very little is possible. And, I think given what we're going through in our nation, in our federal government, talk about trauma in the workplace or trauma outside the workplace because you're locked out of your workplace. Empathy is everything. I mean, and I don't say that flippantly or casually, right? Empathy is really everything if we're going to get through this together. And I have to believe we are going to get through this challenging period in our nation's history together. And we should all keep empathy, front of mind when we're dealing with folks who are going through a lot on a lot of different fronts right now. So let me finish with this. And this is, again, kind of the interviewer's prerogative, because I know you're now president of the board of directors at the Wendt Center. I have fond memories of the services that the Wendt Center in D.C. provides to victims and witnesses, people who have suffered, really acute trauma at times. And talk a little bit about the Wendt Center. It just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Talk a little bit about your work with the center and what kind of services they provide.
It honestly has been such a gift, my connection with the Wendt Center. And to be frank, when a friend first approached me a few years ago about joining the board of the Wendt Center, I said, no, I don't have time for that. I can't do that. I said, I don't have time. I can't possibly. And then, I'm an adjunct professor at American University, and one of my students reached out to me not too long after that conversation I had. And she said, she had graduated, so she was in her early 20s. She said, my boyfriend has recently kind of come to terms with the fact that he was abused as a child. And he is really, really struggling with this. He has no insurance and he needs counseling. I've kind of done as much as I can for him, and I don't know where to send him. Can you think of any place where he could get services? And I said, I can think of one. And it was the Wendt Center. And I realized that the Wendt Center is providing such a needed service of free and very low cost mental health services for those experiencing grief and trauma. And there's not very many places that do that. My nephew died by suicide after going in to try to get mental health services and being turned away because he didn't have any kind of insurance. There are so many people in this country who are dying every day because they cannot get mental health services. And the Wendt Center is stepping into that gap. They provide individual counseling, support groups. They do an incredible grief camp, which, I mean, I have to say, when you say the words grief camp,
doesn't sound like fun.
Doesn't sound like fun. Yeah. It is my favorite day every year. So they actually do 3 of them. So they do a camp for the littles, like little kids, elementary school. They do one for tweens and teens. And it's any kid who has lost someone. Frankly, one of the biggest groups is kids who have lost someone to homicide. And it is this day of, small group connection. I mean, first of all, just having kids be able to see other kids who have lost someone and know they're not alone. But they do drumming and art therapy. They do also football and double dutch. And, it's this connection and dance and movement. And I don't know how to do any of the therapy. I show up and I scoop ice cream and give hugs, and it is so lovely. And at the end of the day, their families come in and are invited back. And it is so beautiful. And it's just this place where there is a recognition that loss is hard, and also you don't have to grieve alone. We will be here for you.
Yeah, the Wendt Center has always done remarkable work. I was a prosecutor, decades ago in DC, and we all knew the Wendt Center, and it's I'm thrilled to see it is still thriving, that you are now the president of the board, and I'm sure it's going to continue to help the folks in DC and around DC that need those services so desperately. So thank you for sitting down with us here on Justice Matters One-on-One, for the work you continue to do. I'll put all the links to all of Kate's, the information and the resources that she's talked about, so you can look her up and keep doing what you're doing. There's a lot of good in the world. And I don't know that we focus on the good these days as much as we seem to be obsessed about the bad and the challenges. So thank you for what you're doing.
Likewise, my friend. Thank you.
Great seeing you.